I suspect that this Anglo Club has never previously been addressed by a professor of Near Eastern Studies. Professor Koller is professor of Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University, but happily for us, he's currently a visiting fellow at London Keys. Until recently, the experimental study of reading, as it's taught to undergraduates, was dominated by English. And English, of course, is a very unsuitable model because it has elements of alphabetic script, of syllabic script, and of ideographic script. And Professor Koller is an authority on mankind's earliest attempts of many varied attempts to invent a script. And I let him speak for himself. Aaron.
Thank you. Well, I wouldn't say authority, but it's of interest to me. So I hope you'll bear with me a bit. What I'm going to try to do this afternoon is a bit of a trial to see if and how these two fields, the history of writing and the science of reading, can help each other. So I come from one side of this with some background in the history of writing. A few years ago, I discovered the science of reading, which is going to sound silly to you, but and discovered that almost immediately in reading some of the literature, it cleared up some questions I had about the history of writing. It allowed me to think about some of the things in ways that I hadn't even realized I could think about. So that sort of pushed me to read a bunch more. And I'll try to show you that there have been a number of historical questions that have been out in the field of, in terms of the history of writing, that can be clarified, both clarifying the question and suggesting answers from the science of reading. Less certain from my perspective is the second half, where I'll try to suggest some ways in which the history of writing may be significant for the science of reading. That's less certain because I'm on far less sure ground when I tread in the science of reading. So I hope you'll be patient with me, and I would really appreciate at the end thoughts, questions, suggestions for going forward, because I think it is a fruitful dialogue, but certainly is not the work of one person and needs to be deepened. So I do want to thank Professor Mullen for the invitation. The Gonville and Keys connection is not an accident. This actually originated over some conversations over lunch months and months ago, where we found that these fields do have a lot to say to each other. And I also want to thank Professor Rassel for some conversations a while ago that have also helped me to think more deeply about some of these issues. Okay, so here's our plan of action for this afternoon. First section will be some contributions of the science of reading to the history of writing, specifically these two questions, which I'll say more about in a moment. And then the second section on possible contributions of the history of writing to the science of reading. So I'll start with a bit about the alphabet, which Professor Mullen mentioned is one very common kind of writing system that we have in our world today. Basically today, everyone outside of Southeast Asia is using an alphabet, and all those alphabets are related. So whether it's Cyrillic or Arabic or Hebrew or English, they're all related alphabets. The alphabet was invented probably somewhere around here, probably in the Sinai. I'll show you one particular site that's a leading candidate. You see this site, I don't know if I can point to this thing. There you go. So right around here, I'm going to zoom in that in a second. There's a site up on this plateau. It's called Sarabat al-Khadam. And in this place, in the middle of essentially nowhere in southern Sinai, is the largest collection of the oldest alphabetic inscriptions that we know of. That's what the site looks like today. This is one of the inscriptions that's actually here in London in the British Museum. And this is Egyptian hieroglyphs. This is plausibly the earliest alphabetic writing that we have. So the alphabet's invented about 4,000 years ago in this site or somewhere else in the Egyptian cultural sphere. But the question that is not asked often enough, but is sometimes asked is, 4,000 years ago the alphabet's invented, but it doesn't really do anything for about a millennium. It doesn't take off. In Mesopotamia, there's already writing in cuneiform, that continues. In Egypt, they're writing in hieroglyphs or hieratic, that continues. And even in places where there wasn't previously writing, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't explode into the world. This is what some of the early alphabetic stuff looks like. And I'm going to skip this, I'll come back to it. But you have sometimes scholars saying things. Frank Moore Cross is a great scholar of ancient Near Eastern studies. He says, well, with the creation of the alphabet, this is the first opportunity for the democratization of culture. The invention of alphabetic writing, literacy spread like wildfire. And although he says so, it's empirically false. It just doesn't actually happen. And Cross, this is written about half a century ago, he knew that the epigraphical record didn't show it, but thought that we just hadn't found things yet. But now it's clear that it just didn't happen. The alphabet does not spread like wildfire. Benjamin Zas is a French Israeli scholar, says it a little bit more cautiously and more recently. The invention of the alphabet brought the potential of literacy to the reach of everyone. So there is a sense that the alphabet ought to revolutionize society because cuneiform and hieroglyphs take years and years of training to master. You need hundreds of signs in order to write anything. It's conceptually not different from Chinese writing today, meaning anyone can learn it, but it's going to take a lot of time. In the ancient world, most people don't have a lot of time. So literacy remains very, very low. But the alphabet, how long could it take to learn the alphabet? We have some quotes from scholars say, a bright student can learn it in half an hour, even a dumb student can learn it in a week, which is, maybe true, probably something like that. And so with that amount of investment of time, why shouldn't this take over and revolutionize the world? And yet it doesn't. And other scholars, more in the last decade or so, have sort of noticed this. André Lemaire says, actually, it just didn't happen. There was no explosion. And in fact, there's a half millennium or even millennium of a dark period where we know the alphabet exists in the world. We can even see it popping up in inscriptions here and there, but it's not doing it. No society has taken the alphabet and run with it and sort of instituted literacy on any sort of broad scale. So why not? So this is a key question that I sort of actually wrote about it maybe 6-7 years ago. But at that time, I was thinking for historical explanations, why does it not take off? So my background leads me to ask, well, societally, sociologically, culturally, the fact that cuneiform is already in place, what's the prestige of such a script? What's the training that would have had to go in? Who would have used the alphabet? And there are all sorts of, I think, cogent historical reasons why the alphabet doesn't take off. But more recently, I started to think of internal reasons. In other words, structural reasons about the early alphabet that make it perhaps actually ill-suited to take off. And now, here we do need to remember that the alphabet, although we can talk about it as an idea, is not a stable concept. So the alphabet that we use is not the Arabic alphabet, it's not the Cyrillic alphabet. And diachronically, when we look back over time, we could talk about many, many dozens or even hundreds of alphabetic systems of writing. So I'm not saying that an alphabet can take off, but I am now thinking the early alphabet may not have been well suited to actually spread literacy. And I'm going to try to quickly work through 3 factors that lead it to be ill-suited for mass literacy. So these are the 3. Failure to mark word divisions. It's highly iconic, non-linear letter shapes, and failure to indicate vowels. I'm just going to show you this very quickly and sort of put it in dialogue with what we know about how we actually read and why these are not just, in my opinion, poor aspects of the alphabet, but actually, assuming that we're dealing with humans with brains like ours, it would have been really hard to read with these aspects. So failure to mark word divisions. This is well known that in our normal speech we don't mark word divisions. There's nothing in the spectrograph that will tell you where one word ends, one word begins. Of course, it gets more subtle in the sentences and in the clauses. There are places where we do pause, But typically, this is just a fairly random one. Spectrograph of 2 plus 7 is less than 10. And there's a couple of things to notice. One is that there's only one S. Phonetically, no one pauses between 2 plus 7. It would sound very stilted if I did. I know there might be a context in which I would do that, but that would be a very stilted, formal presentation where I needed to enunciate each word, which is, I was assured that this angle is not that kind of context. And more generally, there are no spaces at all. Like nothing will tell you where one word begins and one word ends. So of course, we're assuming that as a speaker of the language, somehow this is being translated into words in your brain. And if I asked you actually how many words, you might even be able to tell me that, because there is a process going on that's translating it. But the words part I'm going to leave aside, and that's obviously assuming that you're literate. If you're not literate, it's actually a question whether you even know what a word is, and on that I'll leave aside for now. For writing, though, this is too many words for you to read quickly, but for writing and reading, it turns out that words are really important because that is how we read. The eye jumps that we have that are more or less from one word to the next, short words maybe get lumped in together, are cued by our peripheral vision identifying spaces and knowing how long the next word is, so that our eyes can land accurately and read what we think is smoothly across the page. But that, of course, assumes that there's something on the page to clue me in as to where a word begins and where a word ends. Okay? So you imagine a writing system. You don't have to go too far to imagine it, but imagine a writing system that just doesn't have spaces. There's nothing to clue me in before I've actually read it as to where a word begins or where a word ends. So the only way you can read this is to say it out loud. And that's certainly something that could have worked. I'm going to skip ahead and then come back to it. Could have worked for classical writing. Actually, Professor Mullen has spoken about this in a lecture. That there's all sorts of evidence for non-spacing in classical Greek and Latin writing in antiquity. And the Regnan theory is that works okay if you assume that people will read out loud. So you can read out loud, and then it's not the eyes that are recognizing the words, but the auditory system that's recognizing the words. And so it gets to your brain through a different mode of comprehension. The early writing, so cuneiform, pretty typical cuneiform tablet, there's nothing here to clue you in as to where a word begins or where a word ends. There are occasional spaces that a scribe has chosen to leave, but basically it's just running through. Egyptian's actually a little bit more interesting. I'm not going to belabor this point, but Egyptian has things called determinatives or classifiers that are actually non-phonetic symbols. I'll come back to them a little later on for a different reason, but they're only at the end of words. And I've wondered, I have unfortunately no native Egyptian speakers to test this on, but I've wondered whether that would be sufficient to clue the peripheral vision into knowing where a word would end if you sort of pick out like those are signs. There is some evidence from Japanese where you have signs that only appear at the end of words that are visually distinct, that actually is sufficient to serve the role of spaces. So maybe that would work for Egyptian as well. I don't really know. But if you go back to early alphabetic stuff, so this is actually two words, but there's no space between them. And not only is there no space between them, this is a B sign, a B or bet, and it's actually both the last letter of the first word and the first letter of the second word. So it's literally like that 2 plus 7, where you're going to write one S if you're transcribing phonetically. That's what they're doing in the early alphabet also. So not only they're not marking spaces, but they're really making it as hard as possible to identify words. The only way you could do this would be if you read it out loud. If you read it out loud, you would then understand what was happening there. Why did they not care? That's an interesting question. This is a votive inscription, so it's on a statue that was then given to a temple. No one ever reads votive inscriptions. They're not meant to be read. So it's possible that reading was actually not a primary concern to the early alphabetic writers. It's like people today, there's all these Islamic and Jewish practices of writing letters to dead saints and things like that. So it's writing that's not meant to be read. So we take for granted that if I'm writing it, I want someone else to read it. Like if I'm going to write this up, hopefully someone will read it. Otherwise, what was the point of it all? But some writing is actually not meant to be read. And then there might be a whole different set of considerations as to what makes a good writing system. Anyway, so that's one point about the early alphabet, is that it doesn't mark the division of words. Pretty quickly, you actually do get word dividers. So quickly meaning 500 years. So in my world, that's quickly. But about 500 years after the invention of the alphabet, you do start to get word dividers. It starts with a dot in between words, and then more visually distinctive 2 dots. This is on this lovely statue. So you see that here, they still haven't invented spacing, but they have realized that it would be really helpful to mark where one word begins and one word ends. And that's certainly an advance in terms of the reading. So it's probably not an accident that as the alphabet gets more and more used for real texts, there's also a better system in place for marking things like the ends of words. I didn't include a slide here, but we actually do have spaces already. The earliest text that we know of that's actually spaced is from about 650 BCE. It's actually often in the sort of marginal zone of alphabetic writing, which is interesting because often innovations come in marginal zones where people are not stuck in a trained scribal system. So they can sort of play with different ways of tinkering with their script, including ways that they just think are useful. It's not the way my teacher taught me to write in scribal school, but it seems easier to me. So that might be there's a freedom in marginal zones that, and that's where we first find spacing as well. So spacing exists already 2,700 years ago. It then disappears in classical writing, apparently not needed because of this reading aloud, and then comes back in early medieval European writing. All right, but that's the first point about spacing and its absence that may have in fact hindered the spread of the alphabet. The second point is the shape of letters. I'll do this much more briefly, but the key findings that we have from actually most importantly to my mind, diachronic studies, is that letters tend to change their shape over time and often in the same direction. So they start as like very complicated shapes. Someone comes up with a writing system and they think it'll be great to have this like super complicated shape in their writing system. And it turns out that you check back a century later or 2 centuries later, and a lot of the shapes have been simplified and linearized. So essentially what we need from a shape is just to be recognizable. So it has to be as quickly as possible recognizable by our visual system, which I'm not going to pretend to have any understanding of, but luckily there are people here who do, and different from all other shapes in the system. Right, so it has to be at least distinctive enough. And that sort of leads to these basic conclusions about shapes of signs across writing systems. And the key insight, that, as Dehaene formulated, is that we're basically evolving these shapes to match what we do well. So there's no point in overworking our visual system. We just wanted to tap into the things that we do as quickly as possible. So some really simple shapes, a T, an X, things like that. That's going to be really quick for our brains to recognize. This is the early alphabetic signs. It's literally unclear sometimes whether these are the same shape or different shapes. We have, for example, this guy with a squiggle leg and 2 arms up. And I don't know if that's the same sign as the guy with 1 arm up and 1 arm down. It's certainly not easy to sort of look at it and know at a glance. These are highly iconic, so we know, that's an eye. Over the next millennium, that goes from being an oval to a circle. It loses the dot in the middle because it turns out all of that's just not necessary. Like it's overtaxing in terms of the writing and in terms of the visual system. Like I don't need all those details. I can simplify it. So these things are functional, but essentially not as efficient as they could be. And so this, in terms of the shapes of the letters, is certainly another aspect of the early alphabet that's not well matched to what we actually do well and quickly. Last, the failure to indicate vowels. So you sometimes find things among people who work on the science of reading. As Professor Mullen said, until, at least in my reading, until about 25 years ago, 30 years ago maybe, the vast majority of studies were about English. That's still true statistically, but there's at least an awareness now that we need to compare to other writing systems, right? So what other writing systems do? Do we find the same findings? Right to left writing systems that mark, that do or don't mark vowels obligatorily. And among people who are doing some comparative work, we find statements that in written Hebrew and Arabic today, vowels are not needed. So I think that's wrong. Vowels are needed, or actually at least I would say that they're very, very helpful. In fact, there's differences between Hebrew and Arabic that I won't belabor now. Sorry. But you find things like sometimes in the science of reading, people sort of wander into my field. They start saying things about the history of writing, and it's rarely reliable. So I don't know Ram Frost, but he's at the Hebrew University, so I'm sure he knows modern Hebrew well. But he says things like, as long as Biblical Hebrew was a live spoken language, its writing system was mainly consonantal. So what I think is interesting is not like, I don't want to nitpick. The point is actually, it's a significant point, because actually in ancient times, over the course of the writing system, we already find the development of ways of marking vowels. In other words, this is not something that only later on someone said like, oh, wouldn't it be great to mark vowels? As soon as we have alphabetic writing, we start to see the beginnings of ways of marking vowels, and it only grows over time. We never lose vowels in these systems that start with just consonants. And the reason is really like these three letters. I don't know if people know the modern Hebrew alphabet, but these three letters could be read in at least 7 different ways, depending on the vowels. And now, some of the researchers may say, well, but you identify the root, and that is an important point. It is helpful to identify the root, but that's obviously insufficient for smooth reading. It's usually the case, like in the vast majority of cases, that if I pause and think about it, I'll realize that the syntax will only allow for 1 or maybe 2 readings. So it's not like we have chaos here, that you have 7 possibilities that I don't know what to do. On the other hand, that takes a lot more thinking than we would like in a smooth, efficient writing system. So for smooth for smooth reading, we would like as much information to be there without overtaxing our systems. So already this is going to be probably, I don't know if this will be accessible or not, but already in the very first Aramaic text that we have, which is that text on the statue that I showed you a couple of minutes ago, there are already vowels marked through some of the letters. So there are letters that are serving here as vowel letters. So as soon as there's efficient writing, and as soon as there's writing that's not just being used for votive inscriptions, but actual whole texts, people are already saying like, it would be really good to mark vowels, at least sporadically. And as I said, this only grows over time. So you can actually see this, if anyone here has Hebrew, you can actually see this in the Hebrew Bible, which of course is an anthology of texts over about a millennium. If you look at the spellings in the earlier text and the spellings in the later text, there are more and more vowels marked in the later texts. And this is systematic. It's not just one scribe. All the earlier texts write things like shin lamed shin, being pronounced shalosh, and later texts put a vav, a wow, to mark the o vowel there. And the same thing is true for the name, let's say the name of David. David is written entirely without vowel letters early on, but in later biblical texts, there's a yod that marks that e vowel. So even in antiquity, it was realized that it helps to add vowels. So this is not, it's not, the key point that I want to make is that it's not fair to say that a root-based system like Hebrew and Arabic doesn't need vowels. The evidence against that is that speakers 2,500 years ago thought that vowels could be helpful. And so that seems to be empirical evidence that there's internal pressure to add more and more information to the writing system. Okay, so that's, so I guess just to wrap that up, so those 3 things, the failure to mark the word divisions, failure to mark vowels, and the highly iconic non-linearized letter shapes are all aspects of the early alphabet that would make it really hard to read. So part of the answer as to why does it not spread like wildfire is that it's not ready to. It's really not a great system. It needs to be improved before it can take off and have an impact on the world. 1,000 years later, we have vowel letters, we have markers of word division, and we have much more highly linearized letter shapes. At that point, it can start to, it's used in Phoenician and in Israel and in Aramaic, borrowed by the Greeks by 800, and then it really does spread, quote unquote, like wildfire, and in fact spread literacy in places that literacy had not previously existed. But it just wasn't actually a good enough system to do that earlier on. The second question I said would be that could the inventors of the alphabet have been illiterate? This is an interesting question that's been debated among historians. The alphabet's invented in a world that already has writing. So this cuneiform, this hieroglyphs. Who invented the alphabet? Were they literate in another writing system? Or were they previously illiterate people who made up the alphabet in emulation of, like, they knew that other people wrote and they came up with this system? And there's a lot of considerations to deal with on the historical front. But one aspect that's not typically discussed is whether it's actually cognitively possible that an illiterate person could have invented the alphabet. Here's how to invent an alphabet in 3 easy steps. You don't get credit for doing it anymore because someone did it 4,000 years ago, but if you had to, the first step is to identify the phonemes in your language. Second step is to decide on a sign for each phoneme. Third step is to memorize that and teach it to all your friends. And that's it. Which is actually why it's not inconceivable that it was invented by illiterate people. It's not, how hard could this be? Right? So the question really is this part, identifying phonemes. Like, is that possible for illiterate people? I'm not going to claim it's impossible, but from my understanding, it's really highly unlikely that illiterate people could do that first step, identify the phonemes in their own language. There are practical problems. If you can't write it, like I can maybe articulate them, but now how am I going to remember my list of 25 consonantal phonemes? But even putting that aside, the more important question is, are we aware of the phonemes in our language? And there's some, I think, quite well-known evidence that this is not simple. Again, it's not that it's absolutely impossible, but that if we had to guess, phonemic awareness is usually created by literacy rather than innate. So it's always possible that like one guy or woman did just sort of hit upon this idea, but you know, all things being equal, probably you need to be literate already in order to have that awareness of your own phonemic system to articulate how many phonemes you have in your language. This is going back to the 70s. These great, I translated it into English, meaning the experiment, because the experiments were done in Portuguese. But you take a word like bread and say, just drop the first phoneme, what do you have left? And illiterate people have a very hard time with that. Because the idea that b is a separate phoneme from red is just not actually intuitive. We literate people think this is the most obvious thing in the world, but actually phonemic awareness is carried along and helped along by literacy. I actually love the questions of Pig Latin, which again, like we think of as kids' games, and there are kids' games, but they're actually really interestingly cognitively, because not everyone can play these kids' games, and there have been some interesting studies watching, I guess what in America we call first graders, it's like grade 2 here, year 2, over the course of that year, as they're becoming more and more literate, and they get better and better at Pig Latin, which involves taking that first phoneme and moving it to the end. So this kind of experiment suggests that actually, if you took someone who was totally illiterate, did not know how to read or write any system, and said, just tell me the phonemes in your language, that actually wouldn't have been an easy task at all. Which suggests that literacy may have played a role, prior literacy may have played a role in the alphabet. In other words, that the inventors already learned maybe how to write in Egyptian, and that was enough to then get them to realize that my language has phonemes in it. Now I can take those phonemes apart and create this whole other system. But that literacy may have been a prerequisite. Something that the experiments don't tell us is how much literacy. This is something that's historically important. But if I just know I just know that these signs convey language and someone's read it to me. I can't read it, but I know that someone else can. Is that enough? Like, does that tell me enough to get me to think about language in a different way? So that's harder to tease out from the experimental data because we don't have a lot of people who we are allowed to keep in liminal states of literacy for long enough to do experiments on. But in the ancient world, this is really common, right? There's a lot of people who are exposed to literacy but couldn't actually themselves write it. And that's, so these are questions that I don't know the answers to, but maybe not. More data. Okay, so those are the questions that had bothered me that I now see in different light because of the science of reading. Now I'll turn it around and much more humbly suggest some ways in which the history of writing may give some impetus to questions or maybe even suggestions for the science of reading. And these are the three questions that I'd like to talk about fairly briefly. All right, so I'm going to start actually with a really brief overview of how writing was invented to begin with, as best we understand it. We'll see why this is relevant in a moment. And this is a hypothesis because there is a lot of the data that we would need to prove the hypothesis is not accessible to us. I can elaborate on that later, but the basic hypothesis that no one has a better one than was formulated by an archaeologist named Denise Schmant-Besserat. I actually don't know how she pronounces it. She's been in Texas, so maybe it's Besserat. Anyway, looks like fun. And she noticed that for about 4,000 years, from about 8,000 to 4,000 BCE or so, we find like literally hundreds of these things, tokens, from sites all around the Middle East. And they're often just in museum drawers because no one knows what to do with them. They're game pieces, like they're labeled as different things. No one knows what to do with them. And she came up with a theory about, 35 years ago, that in fact they were an accounting system. And she found the same basic shapes in dozens of sites. And she's like, there seems to be a big accounting system. It's hard to prove because obviously sphere is not a very esoteric shape. So how do you prove that that this is actually a common system? And even if they're related somehow, how do you prove that they mean the same thing? So it's she claimed that there was one system. That's really hard to know. But what we get pretty quickly is that these tokens are being. It is clear that they are being used for accounting. So what do we need accounting for? 6,000 years ago. Well, I might hire you to, or you can hire me, to take care of your sheep one season. And so I'm going to go out and shepherd your flocks for a few months. And I'll come back. You're a rich person, you live in the city. I'll come back in a few months. Now, I'm going to come back and be like, here are your sheep. And you're going to say, but I gave you 1,000 sheep, and here are 400 sheep. Where are the rest of my sheep? And I'm going to say, on the contrary, you only gave me 200 sheep. Here's 400. You should be thanking me. And we have no way of resolving this unless we had some sort of record of how many sheep you had given me. There's no writing. So how do we do this? Per hypothesis, that's what those kind of tokens would do. We would take those tokens and say, here's X number of tokens that mark X number of sheep, put them in this kind of thing, which archaeologists annoyingly call an envelope, which is not an envelope, it's a hollow clay ball that's then sealed. And now we've marked, I don't know, who should be right? Fine, there were 1,000 sheep. And now we've sort of sealed in this number of 1,000 sheep. So when I come back with 400, you have evidence that I now owe you a lot of money. Around 4,000 BC, so 6,000 years ago or so, we start to find these envelopes marked with the shapes of the tokens within on the clay. This is all clay, so it's soft enough to mark. And the hypothesis is that this came from a fairly straightforward problem. In the interim, while I'm out with your sheep, you have no evidence of how many sheep you have. So you want to take out a loan, you just want to count your sheep. You're like, I have no idea how many sheep I have. You can't open the envelope, obviously, because then our deal's off. So this way, you've sort of marked on the outside how many sheep it says inside there are. So there's tokens on the inside, they add up to 1,000. Now I've marked on the outside enough prints or something to add up, to mark that inside there are tokens that add up to 1,000. Pretty quickly, people realize that if you do that, you don't need the tokens anymore, right? Now I have essentially accounting, one word, accounting in graphic form. Right? So I can open this envelope, make it a flat tablet, and just write down a number. And as long as we give it to someone we trust or something, or we bake it so that it can't be tampered with, this is going to be a perfectly legitimate and reliable way of marking it. And that's the first cuneiform tablets we get. Okay, so the first cuneiform tablets are phonetically, there's nothing here. All they are numbers and things. So it'll say like, this is what they look like. It'll say like 1 donkey, 8 donkey, right? There's no plural marker. It doesn't matter. There's nothing here that's not absolutely basic accounting information. So what is it that I'm counting? How many did I count? And that's the first cuneiform tablets that we have. Now this seems conceptually very important. From this, writing develops amazingly quickly. And I say amazingly because it's not obvious that you can do anything else with this system. But really quickly, they realize that if they want to make this more interesting, they're going to have to write, for example, a name. So they're going to have to write, well, who's donkey? Who's she? So I'm going to have to write Marina. How do I write Marina? So I need to come up with some way of writing sounds, because I can't draw a picture of each person that I need. And that seems to spur phonetic writing. Once I can write names, I can write anything. Right? So you check back 1,000 years later, and we're writing love poetry and creation myths and letters from one to another and so on and so forth. But it all starts from essentially bureaucracy of accounting. Now, of course, we have in our own life lots of things that are essentially ideographic, like those early accounting texts. Specifically meant to be ideographic. Like, where do you find this? You find this in places that I don't want to write words. So I find it in an airport where people are speaking 100 different languages. I just need them to know where the lavatories are, right? So I don't want to rely on you speaking my language, so I'm going to have an icon, right? So that's really useful. I don't want to, well, this one actually. I don't want to rely on you reading really quickly as you're getting to something. I just want to label a traffic sign, or maybe you think that's a recycling symbol, with something that's easily recognizable. Of course, the key is that you can put these into words in different ways, right? In your own language, or even if it's in the same language, so everyone would say this means peace, but you'd also know that this is not the right sign to use if you want to say, for example, after the Treaty of Versailles, there was peace. Like, no, that's a different kind of peace. This is very specifically, 1960s, whatever. Anyway, you know what it is. So there are lots of things in our own visual world that go back to this sort of ideographic system. It's true about numerals also, right? So numerals are still ideographic. And you know that because I can put the same numerals in 3 different sentences, pronounce them 3 different ways depending on what language you happen to read in that sentence in. So numerals are conveying an idea, not the phonetic shape of the word. As opposed to normal writing, which more or less conveys the phonetic shape of the word. I'm going to skip this, but it's a really interesting example. Now, even once phonetics was introduced into writing, it never became the only thing. And this is what we have, for example, in numerals. So in cuneiform, for example, you would write the same word for a king or a person, and then just mark a plural sign at the end of that. Now, you read it differently now that it's a plural, but I don't write it differently. I just write the same word followed by the plural sign, and now I, as a reader, know that I'm going to read that as a plural, not as a singular. Now, amazingly, this is the same thing in Egyptian, but I'll skip it for now. But we have the same things in our writing systems, and Professor Rassel has actually written about this in different ways. So in French, the plural is actually like exactly the same, right? You have a silent S that's doing nothing other than marking a plural. So it clues us in, like this is a plural, even though I won't hear it. I have to write it. In English, sometimes it's true with, it's never, as far as I know, silent in English. But we do have the plural morpheme in English is written the same way, even though it's pronounced differently. So we always write it with an S. Now that's phonetically unhelpful sometimes, right? You need to know that actually it's voiced. So after dog, it's going to be dogs, not dogs. After horses, I'm actually going to add that schwa in between. Or the past tense morpheme, which again will be pronounced 3 different ways, but it's always going to be written the same way. So this is actually not conceptually different from what they did in cuneiform or in early hieroglyphs, where there's a visual marker that's phonetically vacuous. It's actually empty phonetically. It's just cluing me into the semantic level of the language. And now, as someone who speaks the language, I know how to read it because I know how to transform that word into a plural, or I know how to transform the word into a past tense. But there is a sometimes complained about, but more often is observed, gap between the writing system and our spoken language. In other words, the phonetic level of our language. So here where I think the history can help is to start with the very simple observation. This is actually where writing all came from, is on the semantic level, not the phonetic level. And so it's not surprising to find these things. It's actually built into every writing system that writing is going to sometimes tap into the sounds, the phonetic level, and sometimes tap into the semantic level. And the interplay, of course, changes from one language to another, and there's specific historical considerations within each language. But this is not something that we ought to be surprised about. On the contrary, there's a history to tell of this feature, of this phenomenon, but it's not surprising at all. So I would formulate the sort of, not even a conclusion, just the observation about this, is that in the history of writing, semantics is primary, phonetics is secondary. On the other hand, as we think about writing today, the function of writing, phonetics is central and semantics is marginal. What that does for our thinking about writing, I don't know. I just want to observe that it's not at all surprising to find these features. And on the contrary, what's surprising is how surprising we find them. They're really so deeply embedded in all of writing that they're not surprising to exist at all. All right, I'm going to skip this part for now and move to two last questions. And I'm going to do these very briefly so we can have hopefully more time for discussion. Okay, so the second point here. Does each language have, actually as an empirical fact, have its ideal writing systems? This has actually been floated as a hypothesis by some scientists. So as a historian, as soon as I read that, I think there's no way. Like, how could that possibly be? Like, what would that mean? Right? Someone looks at the language and designs a writing system. You can imagine such a world, but it's not the world we live in. So it seems highly unlikely, given the fact that every writing system has a history. It just seems highly unlikely that every language would in fact have its ideal writing system. You think about evolutionary biology. So of course it's true, and here we're dealing with millions and millions of years. Of course it's true that organisms are adapted for their environment. Are they perfectly adapted for their environment? Very rarely. Right? You could always imagine something being done differently or better, and maybe, give it another couple of tens of millions of years and you'll get there. And the same thing is basically true with cultural evolution. Like, it's conceivable that one day every writing system would match its language, but we're talking about like a few centuries usually. Like, how could it possibly be that everything would have evolved to be perfectly matched with its language? Also, when you look at the history of writing, it's messy. It's not true that every language and writing system sort of elope, live on an island somewhere, and then can co-evolve to live happily ever after. Typically, writing systems are borrowed from one language to another. That usually involves wars or religion, sometimes being influenced, in other words, so writing spreads with a culture, or sometimes resistance. I would never write that way. That's the way the Romans write, for example. And so you get a lot of sort of messiness to the history of writing that makes it highly unlikely that this is just going to be a neat evolution where a writing system will be neatly matched. Of course, it doesn't mean that there won't be some features that could exist with one language and not with another. I'm going to turn in a second to the question of syllables and syllabaries. So, of course, English is a terrible language, as you started off with, for syllabaries, right? If we need to have a syllable for strength, So this is a disaster. So it makes sense that some languages will be more naturally fit for some kinds of writing. But the idea that this is ever going to be ideal just seems highly unlikely. And that brings me to our last question, which I think is something that I haven't seen discussed as much, but I think is potentially an interesting question, which is there a default writing system? So I just talked about the messiness of human history, which leads it to be, like human history as we know it, which is interesting. But in a vacuum, is there a way that writing most naturally evolves? Now, of course, there's this, as I just said, to some extent language dependent. Some languages will lend themselves to certain kinds of writing more than others. And it's been observed, I think, acutely, that the languages that first adopted writing, maybe first spawned writing, Sumerian is the one that we know the best, in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, is a language in which virtually all words are single syllables. So maybe that helps. Maybe that's the kind of writing where you can easily invent a writing system, whereas a language like English would be a lot harder to do that. But the key point is that even though I said a few minutes ago that this all started with ideographs or logographs, in other words, signs that stand for ideas, 8, donkey, and so on, the first phonetic writing, every time that we can see a first phonetic writing, it always involves syllables. We don't actually know how many times writing has been invented from scratch. This is something that it's sort of gone in waves. So it used to be said that like maybe it was only once out of Mesopotamia. We have it in Egypt like 100 years later. Egyptologists like to say that like, well, maybe it was independent. That seems like a really ridiculous hypothesis to me. Like writing has never existed in the world. It's invented in 3300 BC in Mesopotamia and 3200, 500 miles away. Like the idea that that's a coincidence is sort of boggles the mind. But so it spreads to Egypt. More controversially, about 1500 years later, it's in China. And that's long been a question. Is that an independent invention? Possible. On the other hand, 1500 years, again, not so far apart. There are trade routes. Is it not more likely that the idea of writing at least spread? So that's an interesting question. For the last 50 years or so, the sort of regnant view has been, well, we know that writing was invented at least more than once because it's in Mesoamerica as well. And since Maya is not fully deciphered, but at least deciphered enough for us to now know that it's a real writing system, you can write anything in Mayan. And therefore, the argument goes, since they obviously invented it on their own, there's no obstacle to saying that it was invented independently in China as well. On the other hand, there is evidence for trans-Pacific trade from China to Mesoamerica around 1000 BCE and later. So I'm actually not sure that we're any farther ahead in this question than we were 75 years ago or so. It's conceivable that it went from Mesopotamia to China and then to Mesoamerica. But anyway, I'll leave it aside for now. That's relevant because, of course, the more data we have for thinking about how writing is invented, the more we can start to ask about, like, is there a particular way in which it's always invented? If it was only invented once, it's a vacuous question, right? There's no question at all. However, there's lots of cases in which people who do know about writing invent their own writing system. And this happens in modern times also. So in North America, we have the Cherokee system, Sequoia famously invented, and then there's a number of others in the last 200 years or so. The Vai system in Western Africa actually might have been inspired by the Cherokee system. So these are people who know what writing is. They've seen writing. And they're like, well, my language doesn't have writing. I would like to invent a system. So this is not the invention of writing, but it's the invention of a writing system. And what's interesting is that these are almost always syllabaries. So if I give someone an assignment, make up a writing system, it seems like the most natural way of doing that is to think in terms of syllables. Now, these are very different kinds of languages. There's nothing quite like English in our data set, but in other words, with sort of ridiculous syllables. But there are lots of different kinds of languages, Sometimes syllabaries don't even work out well for the language. So it's not always the case that a syllabary is well matched to the language. In other words, you might have a language that ends syllables with, or words even, with a consonant, but they invent a system where there's an obligatory CV sign. And then they'll have a rule where if it's at the end of a word, don't pronounce a vowel. So you're like, well, this is sort of a silly system. Like, why don't you invent something different? But there seems to be something natural about syllabaries that seems to be some sort of natural way of thinking about my language. I'm going to divide up my language. Syllables seem to be the easiest way to do it, and CV syllables seem to be the most common way. Now, syllabaries are really common. This is really just a partial list. But in the ancient world, they're all over the place in the Eastern Mediterranean. Some of these are not deciphered, but we know enough to know that they're syllabaries. Some of them are deciphered. Modern syllabaries. And then people tend to also think of things, I don't know, there's a lot of terminology that I actually don't love in the history of writing, like abugidas, which you can see is based on A, B, G, D, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, which is the old Arabic order also. And these are sort of alphabets that also mark vowels, which functionally are syllabaries. But because they're written differently, people divide them up differently. Anyway, the point is there's lots of syllabaries. That's the real point. And they tend to be the first writing system invented for a particular culture. And then we tend to see evolution away from syllabaries. So that's just a pattern that you can observe a lot. I noticed in one study, this study, that the number of studies about semisyllabic, I actually don't know why they call them semisyllabic, but semisyllabic, so 0.6% of all studies, this is in one particular subfield, are about syllabaries. And this seems like an area where actually maybe we should be thinking about these more. Now, both in terms of whether the invention of syllabaries taps into something natural, and as to why we keep evolving away from them. In other words, so I put this list up, so these are all extinct. Japanese, which is the only sort of major language here, it's only part of the writing system. So there's really nothing here that's sort of a dominant language here. So syllabaries are very common and then tend to disappear. In other words, cultures tend to evolve away from them. And there's another, that seems like another question that's worth asking, is there a structural reason? It's always possible that no, there's not a structural reason. It's that, Linear B, the Palace Empire, the Palace Society collapsed, so they stopped writing in it. It was fine. That's possible. But it's also possible that there's something that's innate in terms of invention, but then also actually not ideal in terms of use, and so it's given up in favor of other writing systems. I don't know that. It's just an observation that there's a pattern that we keep seeing over and over. So here would be the suggestions. For all I know, people actually did these already, but here would be my suggestions from what I've read. History of writing adds to the case for conceptual priority of the syllable in language perception. So when people are asked to think about how to write, the syllable is the most salient unit. And alongside is whether whether there are structural or cognitive reasons to move away from that. So here's my one-slide summary of my 5 questions with answers, all of which are tentative. So why did the alphabet not transform the world? Because it wasn't matched with things that the human brain does well. Could the inventors of the alphabet have been illiterate? Probably not. Phonemic awareness is a prerequisite for inventing a writing system and hard to get without literacy. Which is primary, meaning or sound? Historically, meaning is primary, and that helps us to think about our contemporary writing systems also. Does each language have its ideal writing system? Really highly unlikely. And is there a default writing system? Syllabaries tend to be the initial invention, and these seem to have been systematically understudied, so that seems like something that we could do more of.
That was a very superb and rich survey for us. You have a great future as experimental psychologist.
I might come back to you for that.
Our custom at the Zango Club is that we have a break for a moment while those who have other obligations can slip away, and then we have So just have a pause. Yes. 2 minutes. We practice for the lecture as well. It's an ambivalence. The speaker has had dinner. He's locked up for an hour. It's terrible. And then at 9 o'clock, the flunky brings you a door run open, and you stand in front of the audience and you start speaking without saying. And when the clock in front of you strikes 10, you must stop.
Oh, I see. No pressure.
So, questions? Yes.
Thank you, that was exciting. I mean, I'm just curious about 2 factors that may have influenced sort of the history of reading or writing. And one is the effort of writing, especially at the beginning. I guess if I had to chisel everything into granite or so, I would happily omit vowels or go for pictures, that make it as efficient as possible. And I just wonder, I mean, how, when parchment and papyrus came along, if that changed the way, people then had more, more effortful writing, more efficient writing system. And the other question is, I mean, how did this go along with the history of, formal education? I mean, I guess the first public schools that people could pay to get their children educated appeared a few centuries before, I think, BC. And I guess that's required in order to make this really popular, not just for religious purposes or accounting. And I guess in both cases that would still within a clique of people and not necessarily be for the wider public. So I was just wondering how this fits into that picture.
Yeah, great points. So the first one, I guess I could have said more about this, but when we find real writing alphabetically, let me start even before that. Cuneiforms on clay tablets. There's somewhere between 950,000 and 1 million in museum collections around the world right now. It's really easy to write on once you get used to it. I mean, it's a different system, but take this and just sort of press in and move on. So that was incredibly common. In Egypt, as soon as they start writing, they start using papyrus. Those two they happen to be chronologically significant because they're very early. For our purposes, there's sort of a happy accident. So clay, once it's baked, is like plastic. It's never going to go anywhere. So that's why we have so much of it. And Egypt, papyrus, of course, organic, it won't last unless you happen to live in a desert, which Egypt is. So we have, I don't know the number actually, but it must be hundreds of thousands of papyri from Egypt also. So we have a ton of data from there. They're not writing alphabetically. So it's basically in the in-between zone, what's now like Israel, Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan a little bit, although that's actually desert also, where the alphabet eventually becomes sort of central. And then, of course, it spreads to Greece and Europe. And there, the stuff that we usually have, like stone and stuff, that's all secondary. Regular writing takes place on papyrus. So we just don't have it because it is not written on clay and is not a desert. And so we don't have the vast majority of it. So what we have is always non-representative of what a normal scribe would have spent most of their time doing. Sometimes you can see it because what you're putting your finger on is very important. So, for example, cursive features, the rounding of a letter to go to the next letter is unhelpful if you're chiseling in stone. Like there's no reason for that to develop. But over time, we actually do see those things developing. And sometimes we don't have the papyrus record to show it, but it must have been that this developed in the ink on papyrus medium and then was transferred back to stones. But you're right. I mean, the key point is that this is all, what we're seeing is really the tip of the iceberg, and it's non-representative tip of the iceberg. So it's we try to infer, we try to sort of keep that in mind and try to infer what must have been going on, but it's never a straightforward expansion. So like, well, we have X amount, it must have been that amount. So it must have been more, and it was different. So that's definitely a problem. Schooling, so Mesopotamia and Egypt, we actually have good evidence for scribal schools more or less from the beginning. The evidence, Mesopotamia, we have a ton of archaeological evidence also, but the evidence usually comes from the scribal texts. So, of course, there's a circle here because the only people writing are scribes, so they can write about scribal schools. We don't know anything, for example, about how you become a carpenter, but we do know how you become a scribe. So we have hundreds of scribal texts from different time periods. So we know what the curriculum is. There are word lists, for example, there's the copying over word lists organized by, there's no alphabetical order, but organized by like things made out of wood, and it's just lists. This is clearly, they're not learning the language, they're just learning to practice writing. And then later on, they're sort of like what we sometimes call canonical texts, so they're going to write the same sort of myths. So it's good for us. We have dozens and dozens of copies of certain texts because this is what every student was doing in second year Akkadian. But we do know, and as you said, it's small circles, so it's generally a father and a son, and maybe a couple of other kids. It's not there's no school buildings. So sometimes it's, when I said there's archaeological evidence, it's usually just because there's a lot of tablets in a particular house. School tablets suggest that this was a place of education, but it's not like we find some sort of big institution. They talk about, the students write things later on when they're scribes, they can reflect on their days. So again, it's a circle. So we have texts from Egypt that talk about how being a scribe is the best job possible. Again, we have no text that says being a carpenter is the best job because they can't write. But scribes can write about how great it is to be a scribe. They talk about how painful it was to be caned when they wrote badly, and all sorts of fun insights into scribal school. So we actually know a good amount about the scribal education, but it's, as you say, like local and small and typically like a family business. And you have to pay a lot for someone else, right? So if I'm a particularly wealthy person, and let's say I have 4 sons, I might say, you know what, my fourth son, I don't know what I'm gonna do with this 4th son. Like, I don't want to divide my estate by 4. That seems like a terrible idea. I'm gonna take my 4th son and train him to be a scribe. So if I'm rich enough and I have enough sons, I might actually send them off to be a scribe, but that's fairly rare. Much more typical is that it's just a family business, and we can actually sort of trace it in families over centuries.
So if you go first, and
Are you yes. Thank you. I wanted to ask about the last question that you had about the syllabaries, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts of the roles of articulation, salience, and letter sound mapping. I'll explain what I mean. So one of the really tricky things about alphabetic writing systems is that the mapping between the sounds in our language and the letters is obviously not straightforward, and even if you have a very transparent writing system, such as German is fairly transparent or Spanish is pretty transparent, it's never a straightforward mapping of one-to-one. Now, the advantage a syllable has is that it's phonetically more stable, and it's also more prominent. So, for example, if you look at the speech envelope or just the intensity of speech, it tends to center around the peak of a syllable, and that's usually the vowel. And so syllables are not only more stable phonetically, but also more marked. So it kind of makes sense that if you need to extract something from language, and as you explained really nicely, phonemes are notoriously difficult to detect, then a syllable might make a lot of sense. So yeah, what do you think?
Oh, it sounds really interesting. So I'll give you a piece of data that sounds like it's something of I won't say an answer, but contributing to this conversation. So in cuneiform, when they're writing Akkadian in cuneiform, it's a syllabary, more or less, either CV or VC or CVC, which is obviously inefficient, but that's what they had. But interestingly, the vowels are stable. So there's only 3 vowels, a, I, U, long and short. But they do things like all dental plosives might be written with the same sign. So D, T, and they have an emphatic pa or something. May all be written with the same sign. Not always, so it's different enough that we know that they actually did have 3 different consonantal phonemes there. But sometimes they don't care, and they write T for a D or a T.
T for the emphatic or whatever. So I think that does support what you're saying, that they're in the writing system, the vowel is more central than the consonant. They're clustering them, so they never write a D for a B or something. But there seems to be some flexibility in which dental plosive they'll write for a particular word. I don't know. I'm sure there is a seriological work on like systematizing this. I actually don't know if people have discerned rules as to when this is done, when it's not. But it's definitely, it's very common. I mean, you always have to, like in reading the Akkadian, you always have to write down what they wrote, and then be aware of the fact that it might actually be one of the other related consonants. So I don't know, yeah, I mean, what you're saying basically makes a lot of sense. It seems like a fairly good hypothesis for why syllabaries would be an intuitively natural way of writing.
They're also usually what babies start with, right? When they babble,
Or babies just-
they're usually pseudosyllables.
Yeah. I mean, and is it CV? Just like that?
That's a very common tendency, I think,
sounds right.
across most languages.
Interesting.
I mean, that's not my specialism, so I'm just speculating.
Oh,
That
Yeah, that
sounds-
common.
Sounds exciting. And sorry, just one final thought. Then why isn't an alphabet afterwards? I wonder if that's because if you have syllabaries, you need to remember a lot more syllables. And so if you want to make it efficient, then alphabet makes sense. So I guess from a cognitive learning, how do we discover how to put this down in writing perspective, it makes sense to have a wider approach that you then narrow down. But then when you want to be efficient in the end, alphabet makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does cut in both directions. So I should say, but I think I didn't say this clearly, I actually don't know of any cases where a syllabary evolved into an alphabet.
Oh, right.
Like actually dropped the vowels. On the contrary, we have like what they call abolidas, where alphabets developed obligatory vowel markings, which make them sort of functionally syllabaries. But those do have the advantage of being a very neat, in terms of what it's just the quantitative part. So if you take your, let's say, 25 consonantal phonemes, and just say each one will be marked, let's say, with a line above, a line below, or a line in the middle for a vowel. So it's still cognitively, like, this is not a heavy load, right? So it's still 25, and there's just 3 more signs that are, so it's a nice matrix. So it's, as you say, most of the initial syllabaries are not that neat. So it's not like you take 25 times 3, I mean, you do. So you wind up with 75 or 90 different signs that you have to remember, and that, I think you're absolutely right, is just hard to do. But it is interesting that they never drop them. Like no one ever actually says like, oh, we can just simplify this and drop the vowels.
Is there a tendency for languages who have, because obviously syllable structures vary massively.
Right.
English has tons of different syllables, but other languages, like, I don't actually know, but other languages have a much more limited number of syllables. So is there a tendency for them to maybe keep their syllable, or in the first place develop that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually don't know that it's been sort of mapped, checked one to one. There are clearly cases where it's not a good match. So linear B is a syllabary. It's used to write archaic Greek. Greek is, there's consonant cluster. There's all sorts of reasons why this is a bad idea. And yet they do it. And they're just basically rules like, so drop the vowel if it doesn't belong, which is not an efficient way of doing it. So it's not the case that it's sort of neatly maps, like only languages that have neat CV syllables wind up using syllabaries. It's possible that there's a limit, like you just can't do it for English, but if you had strength, so you'd have in linear B, you'd have something like C, T, Re, Ni, Th. And you'd have to know, don't pronounce half of those vowels because they're just not actually pronounced in your language. It's not as impossible, but I think, you're certainly right that there ought to be tendencies. I actually don't know empirically whether there are or not.
A related question. Given that Japanese would be somewhat favorable to syllabaries because of the limited number of syllables, do we have within historical time corpora of data on the advent and the uptake of katakana and hiragana, or even contemporary commentary on that in Japanese?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I don't know.
Because, I mean, if other inventions of syllabaries had manifestly flopped, but we still have katakana and hiragana, then maybe that tells us something.
Yeah, no, that seems like a very insightful place to look for both the question of whether it's well matched and how that affects it, and also, as you say, sort of meta-linguistic commentary. It's not so long ago, like maybe people are actually writing about it. I just don't know, but
That's your next paper.
well.
Yes, one brief comment and one question. I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but Ugaritic is arguably a case where a syllabary dropped the vowels and became alphabetic. Because they're using cuneiform signs, but then they remodel them, they reanalyze them, drop the vowels because they want to make an alphabet. Anyway, I'm sure everybody in here has opinions about Ugaritic. My question is, and I want to thank you for this really valuable paper. I'm coming from the ancient Near Eastern side, obviously. I think on your first question, why did it not transform the world? I think your cognitive points are really exciting, and I've never heard of them before. So
Thank you.
Keep going, and this is a wonderful forum to develop these ideas. I wonder if you've thought about the social factor. That is to say, there's not only these entrenched scribal schools, but you have very hierarchical societies for the first 600-700 years of the alphabet. And then all of a sudden, when all of these empires collapse toward the end of the first millennium, it's the next phase where you have these smaller scale societies, city-states and so forth, where the alphabet takes root and does spread like wildfire.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And exactly as you say, there's, you think of the alphabet as something like a disruptive innovation where the societies that had their writing systems, it's not only that they were well entrenched and therefore prestigious, but there's no need to adopt something else. It's actually working quite well, and it goes on working for the next 2,000 years quite well. It's actually fine. If you're going to adopt literacy for the first time, then this is a much lower bar of entry, because you don't have to start scribal schools where you're going to have 5 years of training. It really does take very little time to learn an alphabet. It's really true. So I think that's absolutely right. It's a society that doesn't already have a system in place that can sort of easily adopt this. They could adopt the cuneiform system, but that's a massive investment of essentially social infrastructure that you don't need to invest in if you could go a different route. But I think that's exactly right. The Ugaritic, I have an opinion about Ugaritic, but the only thing I'd say is that they're not adopting the cuneiform signs. They're adopting the medium of cuneiform, but there's no visual connection or structural connection between Akkadian cuneiform and Ugaritic cuneiform. They're basically just saying, like, I can model this on the alphabet in clay. So, I mean, you're right. It's a very important chapter here. I don't think it's quite an example of where someone took a syllabary and evolved to an alphabet, but it is relevant, though. That's a good point. Yes.
I'm curious about the fact that you mentioned that that people can learn to read very quickly, because I worked with illiterate populations in North India, and it was surprisingly difficult to go from being able to recite the alphabet to actually reading. Yeah. And we found that they were able to actually recite the alphabet fairly quickly, and it is so hard to make the jump to actual reading. And people were really quite puzzled in this program about how to make that. And so I'm quite curious about the evidence for it's really easy if you're not already literate.
Right. So this is actually a question of Professor Rasso, because she works on teaching people to read. But I'll just say that why that doesn't bother me in terms of the early stuff is that the early alphabet, so I don't know anything about the writing system that you were teaching, but people have said, oh, it's actually not so easy to learn to read, which is, I know, we all went through it. Like it took us, I don't know, depending on when you start and when you think you learn to read, even you got the rudimentary stuff down fairly early on, but like when are you fully literate? That's not a quick process. It's definitely many years of school, and we have far more intensive school than anyone in the ancient world. So, is it really a quick process? So part of that, though, is actually part of these structural questions, because the very early alphabet is just phonetic writing. In other words, I mean just the first few hundred years of the alphabet. There's no exceptional spellings. There's no like, oh, this is a silent letter. This is not pronounced the same way as that, even though it looks the same, right? So again, I don't know what you were teaching. In English, of course it takes a long time to read, because you have to learn that like weight is, even though it looks exactly the same as height and has a bizarre number of silent letters in it, isn't pronounced the same way. Now, a lot of that is sheer memorization, and this just takes a lot of time. But the very early alphabet is purely phonetic. There's no exceptional spellings, there's nothing that's silent. They're just writing what they hear. So if you knew that all you have to do is pronounce it out loud and it would be a word in your language, that ought to be a lot faster than what we think of. So again, every language has its own quirks, and I'm sure there's things that take a longer time and shorter time. But ancient alphabet should have been like on the extreme short time, as opposed to like what we're often familiar with. But I don't know, you probably studied the differences there.
So there are four of you competing now. I think you were first, so do ask your question.
Sure, I had two questions actually. The first one had to do with the topic of how you were saying how alphabets originally didn't have a marker for sort of the end of words or spaces, and that brought to mind how in Hebrew there are certain letters like mem, M sound, that are written differently if they're at the end of a word, mem sofit, but pronounced the same. I was wondering if, maybe it's an ignorant question, but how something like that came about, if it was related to that process of marking the end of words, or it's a more modern occurrence, or if that happens in other languages. And the second question was, just thinking diachronically, if languages sort of evolved to become more optimized to be easier to read, why we see the persistence of multiple letters that can symbolize the same phoneme. So again, in something like Hebrew, you have tet and taf, both for T sounds, or in English it'll be example as well, why we see the persistence of that redundancy.
Yeah, those are both great observations. The final letters in Hebrew we actually can trace because we have enough epigraphic material, so we can actually see that in the 4th century BCE, that's when they start showing up. They actually are relevant to the scribal question earlier. Like the details don't matter that much, but essentially almost all of them are where a scribe at the end of a word, as opposed to the middle of a word, just sort of lets the ink fall. So instead of hooking to the next one, they just let it fall. So it's easy to see how they would develop, or how there would be a different sign at the end of the word than in the middle of a word. I've also wondered, but have no proof as to whether it was also helpful for readers to mark the end of words. It's as you said, there's only 5 letters like that, so it's unsystematic, but it can help. There is already spacing there, so it would be redundant in terms of technically marking. But there's lots of redundancies in writing systems, and that's it doesn't mean it wasn't actually perceived as helpful. So in other words, my guess would be, but it's really just I don't have any way of proving it, is that it started as a scribal habit and was perceived as actually helpful, and therefore spread and became regularized. The point about different signs serving for the same phoneme, so each one has its own story. But the crux of the whole thing is that people are stubborn, and writing systems in particular don't change nearly as fast as language does, and sometimes won't change at all. So both English and Hebrew have sort of very stubbornly conservative writing systems at this point that don't match the spoken language all that well, but no one will change them, and I'm not advocating changing, because I think actually sometimes that actually is synchronically helpful to have these inconsistencies, because you get things like, oh, that belongs to that root. One example is, you take the word like electric, it ends with a C, and you build the noun electricity, there where the C is pronounced an S, or electrician, where the C is pronounced as a sh. And so phonetically, this is ridiculous. Like my same C is being pronounced 3 different ways. On the other hand, semantically, this is great, right? If I change that last thing, I would never recognize the word electric in electricity and electrician. So it's conveying other information, but not phonetic information. And that sort of goes back to the point I was trying to make, that's actually innate, that's like systematic in language. Like language is never going to be just phonetic, and actually we would be like much more impoverished in terms of our reading, just abilities, if it was purely phonetic. So it's not only conservatism, meaning like we don't have a mechanism for change, but conservatism that actually is perceived as playing some other role. So it does something else in the writing system, not phonetics.
I should invite Professor Russell to comment here because I know you have to go.
I actually sort of had an observation. This is very stimulating. But I actually just wanted to caution against thinking about how we read in modern times informing your understanding of why the alphabet didn't take off. And what we do when we read in modern reading is something that's very strange. And it's built on the fact that we are surrounded by text. So the whole notion of being able to take in information from the periphery about spacing, you learn to do that over many, many years when you're confronted with vast amounts of text. And just to give an example, we've just done a corpus of the top 400 books for 7 to 9-year-olds. And in these top 400 books, most popular books, there's 52,000 unique words, right? So that's a measure of the sort of exposure people get to text. And so when you look at a modern reader, like a Hebrew reader, taking out the vowels is a great thing to do because alphabets are terribly redundant, right? There's too much information in them, and taking out the vowels actually speeds you up, right? Because you don't need all that. You can get rid of any ambiguity through context. But I think that Olaf's point about the sort of difficulty in producing is very important, because my understanding is that there's much less text in the sorts of time periods you're looking at. So if there's only one word because you've had to hammer it into the stone, then it might be very important to have the vowels. I am unsure of the extent to which looking at reading today, I think it's very interesting, but I'm unsure of the extent to which it can be really informative as to why an alphabet didn't take off in a situation that has much, much less text.
Right, that's really interesting. I guess 2 just thoughts spurred by that. One is, I think the question actually, it's not circular, but the question really is, but why didn't the alphabet enable the world to become a world in which there was a lot of text? So, of course, you're right, it can't start with that. Question, why doesn't that develop? And that's, I think, where these considerations might be useful. Modern Hebrew, I didn't talk about it, but modern Hebrew is actually less conservative than modern Arabic. So modern Arabic really uses the classical orthography, even when it doesn't match. Modern Hebrew came up with all these other ways of marking vowels that are not vowels. So the vowel letters and redundant consonants and things that, there's actually a lot of vowel information, even though it looks like it's just consonantal. It is consonantal in a sense, but actually there's lots of like yuds serving as markers. You can only mark either an E or an A vowel. A double vav can mark an A vowel. A single vav can mark an O or an U vowel. So that's all actually in there. So when people say like, oh, modern Hebrew doesn't mark vowels, that's not really right. Meaning old epigraphic Hebrew actually doesn't mark vowels. And it's not easy to read. I mean, there's debates to today about like, what word was that? Is that a noun or a verb? Things like that. But modern Hebrew has compensated. So they didn't want to include the full vowel system. And it's actually amazing. Like I've given Israeli students fully vocalized text. They don't even see the vowel dots. Like they've just learned to ignore the vowel dots. So they'll mispronounce it even though the information's like sitting in front of them. But the writing system has compensated because a fully unvoweled text is not good either. So I don't know, maybe it's hit some sort of happy medium. I don't, it's hard to know. But in actually, at least in academic writing, there'll sometimes be like a sporadic vowel marked where the writer perceived that this could actually be ambiguous, right? So that also is like the writing system without those vowels, we all know is not enough. When you need it, when you need those extra vowels is a gray area. But I don't know, I mean, your big point is obviously something I need to, I don't know how to, I mean, I have to think about it, I don't know how to make progress on. But
we're close to 6 o'clock. You had a question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about your hypothesis about a priority of meaning and sound.
Yes.
And I'd like to make some reference to Lev Vygotsky and to put it in the context of cognitive development. And if we want to know about cognitive development, in his opinion, we have to consider the development of symbolic system like language, like writing system. And in this context, when we have some symbol or sound or sign, we should have some equivalent in our cognition. It is impossible to have some sign or sound or mark if it is not meaning in our cognition, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense for human being. So in this case, is it more correct to speak about parallel development of sound, of symbol, of sign and meaning in the context of higher mental functions?
I don't think I know the answer to that question. I'd say that just in terms of what we see in the record, the semantic signs come first, and as the logograms or ideograms come first, and it takes another century or two to develop phonograms, signs that encode for sounds but no meanings. I don't know how to ask the question what their cognitive reality was. I'm trying to think of whether we can use something else to sort of triangulate to that, but I don't know. I mean, if it's well established that such and such sign must presuppose some sort of cognitive development, then I guess we can use that to go back and say, oh, apparently they developed this. But I don't know how to do this independently, without getting into a circle of that connection. I don't know. That sounds interesting.
At this uncertain moment, we probably better stop.
I have gotten to the end of what I know.
I see, and it's very pleasing to see faces I don't recognize, and very pleasing people who come from other departments and to the Sangha Club talk. But I should explain our custom. At this moment, it's my obligation to take Professor Koller to all bar one in Regent Street and give him a strong drink.
That would have been helpful before.
It's my obligation also to buy a drink for anyone else who wants to come and join the discussion, to continue the discussion for a few minutes in all bar one. So that's where you'll find us. And it only remains to thank Aaron Koller not only for a marvelous talk, but for one of the best discussions I've known at the Sangha Club for a long time.